Tom, what you said about research, I think I remember many, many years ago reading about Hemingway's Iceberg. The idea being that you do the research that you do and the 10% above the water is what actually shows, but that 90% is like a floating root, you know, a floating base that supports the rest of it. I think the idea is it gives you confidence to show the 10% because you know what you're doing in the 90% below the surface.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And I think the reader can sense if everything in the book is your entire content of research, people are going to smell that straight away.
Well, that's what's a heavy last detail.
Yeah, because it's also it's going to feel like it's going to feel like proof of a credibility rather than what it should be, which is just material touches to the story. Yeah. That's a very useful. In fact, if you probably look at it, it probably is something like 90-10 when it comes to.
In the end.
Because also you have to love the research. Otherwise, what are you doing? It just becomes a kind of. There's almost a kind of emptiness to it, like a kind of.
It also has that image of like immersion and then breaking through. You know, and I think that's probably a good attitude.
Research can also be a marvelous time waster. and a way not to write anything. I remember I taught a short story workshop one time over a period of a couple of months. The class met once a week. And there was one woman there who was wanted to write a short story, I think set in Jerusalem. And it was only going to be like a 3,000 or 4,000 word short story. And she was doing this endless research and getting street plans and maps and everything else. And I finally said, you know, all of this is a wonderful way never to write the first sentence. You know, the kind of research she was doing would not have been disproportionate if she were writing a substantial novel. But she just wanted this much, and no one was going to read that short story in order to find out, you know, how to find a coffee shop in Tel Aviv or anything.
Yeah, no, and I should say that actually with Travel Before Deciding, exactly that, which is you're aware that it's a trap. You can just write notes for 2 years, waiting to start. And I started Travel Before after only 2 months of research, because I knew exactly that I'd have to do the research and the writing simultaneously, otherwise I would never have written the book. And so that involves a lot of going back and changing stuff, as it's quite a messy process because you learn things, you get things wrong, you have to go and correct it. But at least you get the book done, rather than, I would say absolutely off that point that it would be a disastrous technique to spend 2 years researching and then writing.
Well, I can tell a good story on myself. It suddenly occurred to me that was far more ridiculous than the woman with her story in Jerusalem. When I was about 19 or so, and I published a batch of short stories in pulp magazines, and I thought I would like to write a novel, and I got the idea that I would like to write a novel about the 1916 Irish Rising in Dublin. But I thought, you know, you really need a fair amount of background to do this. And I bought lots of books, and I thought, you really have to start early on. So the first book I was reading toward this end was Oman's book, England Before the Norman Conquest. And working my way up gradually. So that was a lot worse than the poor woman with her story in Jerusalem. I never wrote the book.
How far did you get in the research? How close?
Well, I read a lot of interesting stuff. Some of relatively contemporary, like Tom Berry's book on the Rising in Cork and the Civil War in Cork and things like that, and for various Irish history. I read a lot of Trevelyan, who was such a wonderful writer, and that you know, the history hasn't stayed with me, but I hope some of the prose has. But different stuff. No, I never really made plans for the book. I think there must have been a point. I don't know when I realized that was not the book I was going to write.
A related question to the research is, how do you feel about outlining plot, sort of going forward? How much plot do you need to be able to see over the horizon versus making it up as you go along?
Well, I don't outline. I have occasionally, but not in years. And I just make it up as I go along. Sometimes I have some sense of where it's going. Sometimes I don't have much sense. If I really have a good opening sequence in mind, I'm comfortable writing that and seeing where it leads. And you know, you throw out a certain amount of things that don't work, but it's apt to work often enough. The one thing that was really difficult was when what I had to start with was the ending. You can't write the ending and then see what came in front of it. It doesn't work that way. And the more I thought about it, the clearer the ending became. This wound up being a book called A Dance at the Slaughterhouse, and it did well and everything, but I could have written the ending of that essentially right from the gun, but instead I wound up writing about 200 pages that I threw away and then starting over before I could find the story that went in front of this ending. It was a curious experience. You must outline some.
Yeah, no, I do outline.
Yeah, it's a different kind of book.
Yeah, I do like outlining, but I would say that I like both in the sense that I like to outline, so I feel like I know where I'm going, but then you can, you know, just because you outline doesn't mean you can't throw it all away and you can completely change direction. So I, you know, in a weird way I do both. I mean, the outline for my new book is now, I don't even look at it now, but it was useful to do it in a sense. I like structure. I like thinking about the shape of things. It helps me. I even draw little pictures. I mean, I you know, all kinds of stuff. But I mean, I think, you know, you need to find out what works. There's no rule to it. I think you need to find out what you're comfortable with. And I'm definitely comfortable with doing, you know, that feeling of this is what it is, and then going into it, and then just going with whether I think works and what doesn't work. So it's a mixture of the two for me.
Speaking of structure, I'm very curious if you're going to solve a crime in the course of the novel, don't you have to have some induction and deduction and maybe some other mathematical aspects in order for it to work, for it to be believable?
All I would say when it comes to the crime is you can do whatever you want. I mean, you don't have to take. There's one part of crime fiction which is solving something, which I think is what you're talking about, deduction in terms of collection of information, putting it together, the puzzle element of it, or you can go the forensic element of it, the science element. But you can also use it to do a crime story in a sense where you can push all that to the side and use it as a shape for a story. In a sense, the deduction might not even be, you know, the engine of it. I mean, you could just use it because the crime structure, a murder and the question, is a very useful, you know, in Lawrence's book, it was bringing these two characters together in an interesting way. You then had the deduction as well, but you know, you could have done a different thing with that story. You could just use it to bring two people together. You could do all kinds of things with it. It depends what you want to do with it.
Does it make sense?
Well, unless you do something that doesn't have to make sense. I mean, you know, it depends what you want to do. You don't have to use crime in a sort of very logical. You could do whatever you want with it, in a sense, but you have to make that decision at the beginning. And if you want to do a deduction story, then obviously that's, you know, you have to. If CSI has to make sense, for example, but if you did something fantastical with a crime, it could be less literal. It could be less sequential.
So I'm curious
Well, for me, the crime structure is it's about opening a world. It's about opening a set of characters. It's a very powerful way, and it gives it a shape. That, I mean, I always think when I pick up a book, I like to sort of feel there are questions unanswered. I like crime as a way of positing lots of questions. In a sense, what happens next? It draws people in. It's a very powerful engine through a story. And through Agent 6, it's through a very disparate story that's spread over a long period. Without the crime, I think it would have been a difficult story to tell. The crime, in a sense, holds it together. And for the reader, it means you can knit these very different worlds together through the crime. So that was the aspect for me. It's less of the, I'm less of a CSI sort of forensic or the sort of puzzly fun of Sherlock Holmes. That's less for me. It's more about holding a different kind of story together. I don't know how you see it.
Well, crime fiction is a remarkably broad canopy, and almost anything can fit under it. I know Otto Penzler's definition of mystery, if you will, or crime novel is any work of fiction in which a crime or the threat of a crime is of paramount importance to the plot. And that's a pretty good definition.
Yeah, that does seem pretty good.
Yes?
The West 50s. Have you lived there for most of your life or for part of your life? I've always been captivated by the West 50s. I worked there and I had lived there in the past and shopped at the Pioneer and so on.
I was living in the West 50s and 58th between 8th and 9th when I started writing about Matthew Scudder, and I lived there for not that long, but I moved and he didn't. He moved across the street, of course, from his hotel to the Park Vendôme, but outside of that, he stayed in the neighborhood. I was there in the mid-70s, really. Yes?
Well, that's a good segue into my question, which is, what's so wonderful about the Scudder books is the voice, as we just saw and reading them. But I mean, it seems kind of almost childish. Are you Matt Scudder? I mean, he is a character, and then you are the author, and yet you've written so many books in which he writes in the first person. Do you have to kind of get into his personality? Because it seems like in some interviews, it's hard to say this, but you don't necessarily even like him that much. I mean, do you? What do you? I said, you don't seem to be fully in sympathy with him. I mean, do you like Matthew Scudder?
Yeah.
But I mean, his observations are...
I probably would have stopped writing about him a long time ago if I didn't have a fondness for the fellow. No, it's, I write a lot of different books, and there are a lot of characters that one could as easily identify me with, There are a whole series of books about a rather light-hearted burglar, and others about a rather introspective assassin.
Which are excellent,
Thank you.
may I ask,
I agree, I must say.
do the Scudder books really outsell your other series? I mean, are they the biggest sellers, or do they all sell well?
I make a living. There's a fair amount of overlap, I think, with the readers, but some people prefer some to others. Yeah.
Over the years, is it common to discard 200 pages, and do you end up keeping that and returning to some of that material?
I'm sorry, I'm not getting it.
Over the years, is it common to discard 200 pages of something you've written, and do you end up going back to it to salvage bits and pieces of it?
As you mean the way I threw it away with the Dance of the Slaughters, of those 200 pages, there was a half a page that I was able to make some use of, actually. But no, I don't like it when that happens. You know, there's no soil bank program for writers. You don't plow the crops under and get paid for it. It's just a dead loss. So I hate it when that happens, but I've had some things that I haven't finished, and I'd rather have a book that I don't finish than finish it and produce a book that's no good. Though I've probably done that too.
How many different pseudonyms have you had? Do they have, how do you pick the names, and do they represent different personalities?
Well, to a degree, probably they might represent different aspects of self. But I just this past year, incidentally, about 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, I realized that I was done writing fiction, that I'd just done it long enough and certainly said anything I had to say many times over, and the higher moral point would be not to write the book, but to spare the tree. You know, it had reached that point in my career. And I said I thought I was probably done writing novels. And in 2011, I published, I think, 7 new books. So I seem to have been wrong about that. Not all of those were novels, but 2 were. And one was the first book that I did under a pen name in over 30 years. And it was a book called Getting Off, and it was done under an open pen name. The byline reads, Lawrence Block writing as Jill Emerson. And so that's the first time I've used a pen name in a long time. Early on, there were various reasons, but it was really a long time ago. As to how many pen names I've used at one time or another, I don't really know. I don't have a count. That's like.
But did you have any fun picking the names? Do you remember the names, and what was the?
I would probably remember the names. Yeah, I don't think I wrote under any names that I don't recall.
My wife is a writer. She's stressing out about whether or not to write under her own name or different names, and she sits around picking different names every night.
Does she put on different wigs and everything? Because I can see where this could be fun for you.
I mean, one of my favorite novelists is a French detective novelist named Frederick Dard, and he wrote under the name San Antonio. And then for a different series, he wrote under some other names. And, you know, he inhabited that persona in one name, and then he, you know, did opposite. He, like, wrote some anti-hero novels in a different persona, and, you know, so there was some meaning to it a little bit.
But why is your wife worried about it?
Well, she's got a married existence. She's also a lawyer. She went to Columbia, so she tries to write experimental fiction, but she wants to make money, so she wants to write young adult novels and, you know, make money. And so there's a different personality for a young adult novel writer and another one for Diane Williams kind of thing, and, you know, they're different niches.
I'm gonna be really outrageous. I'm gonna make a suggestion. I'd say that she should, like, bench the whole name issue, like, completely. That's what I think. It's just of all the things to worry about, like, I wouldn't even put that on the list. You know what I mean? If she's written a great young adult novel, and who cares what the name is? I mean, that's just something you can worry about to distract yourself. It's a red herring, to use a crime.
Except that it might free her somewhat to think, at least, that she's going to do it under a pen name.
But psychologically?
Yeah.
Is it a psychological thing,
Yeah.
you think?
She has different images that she associates with a name like Claudette or.
We're moving into therapy here.
And then can we have maybe one more question, and then we can all have some wine and buy tons of books. So,
I would ask Tom about the influence of film. I know you wrote films before you wrote fiction, you write films now. Critics have praised your fiction as being very filmic, and I wondered, could you have written Child 44, Agent 6, The Secret Speech without that background in writing films? Do you see your prose as filmic?
Yeah, I think structure is useful. That's the boring side of it, is structure. The more interesting side is that I like to root every chapter with an image. I like it to feel physical. I don't like, and this isn't a comment on any other writer, but for me, I don't like it when it becomes too abstract. It needs to be rooted in something that you can get your head around. I want you to feel it. I want you to feel the book as has a kind of material weight to it. And that's what film does. Film roots things in something that you can see. And the emotion is something visual. You can attach it to something. It's not just a thought. So it's very important for me, I think, the film aspect, yeah.